data is not the body. Data is a representation of the body. And that is where the delay is experienced. That is where we need to locate truth. And that is where we need to locate breaches of data, falsehood, of power.
Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Podcast, where we talk about our relationship with technology and the role it plays in our day to day lives, from artificial intelligence to online dating and ride sharing apps. This podcast invites past residents of our annual residency, the Digital Everyday, to look at our tech touchpoints through a feminist lens. My name is Riddhima Sharma, and I'll be your host for this episode. This week, we have Kenny Bhatia, who is a resident of the Digital Everyday in 2023, to share some of their experiences. They hold a BA in English Literature from Durham University and an MA in Applied Theatre in Social, Educational and Community Context from Goldsmiths University of London. They currently work as a teaching fellow in Kashmir, and their work is centered at the intersections of arts, education and social justice. And the research explores these through body, space, and language. And in their free time, they choose to read, bake, and sing to themselves. How exciting. Thank you so much for being here, Kenny, and for having this conversation. Just to start off, is there anything you would like to share apart from, of course, the official bio about yourselves?
If there's anything I identify as, is to identify as a learner. So I just like being in classrooms in any form.
That's how I feel too. So what were some of the reasons that you decided to join this course? What appealed to you about it?
There's quite a few reasons. But centrally, see, you can't separate the personal and the political. The first fundamental feminist knowledge that you kind of gain the first time you enter feminism, right? Being someone who works in the social justice sector, I had no idea how data digital works, how it directly modulates the body. And I think modulate as a word functions here because the body functions around data, the data functions around body. But every time I heard someone say, oh, but internet should not exist. Instagram is like so bad. And being someone who lives with psychosocial disabilities, I would often be left at odds with it. But for so many people with disabilities, internet is a boon in so many ways. It's a terror also, undoubtedly, but it's a boon. It makes you engage. It's like, it's okay to have that nuance. Yes, it's okay to defend data, defend internet in so many ways, but also to recognize that it has its limitations, it has its dangers and drawbacks also.
You were working as a research assistant. So was this something related to the teaching work that you were doing, or was it at a different kind of organization?
At that time, I was working with MITA, with Professor Harmony Siganporia, who's an excellent cultural and social historian. And I was basically expanding my know-how of cultural studies, looking into culture and social justice and all of that. My MA thesis was essentially on building solidarity online through Zoom. Yeah, so I basically built a model of performance through headphone orbiting theater, but like building solidarities through this platform by putting one body over the other. So the course, the Digital Everyday course, essentially allowed me to also look into a more nuanced way to build on that thesis. And this was just a research and R&D phase of that performance that I hope to put it up one day. So the TDE actually allowed me to look into it further. I was like, is there no way that solidarities can be built even when we are so torn apart in this time of COVID? Is there no way that we can actually use Zoom as a platform to build these solidarity so that our work is not at a halt? That was the beginning of it. And then I started asking questions like, who is represented here on the Zoom platform? And then the idea of IP addresses. Who can be tracked here? Whose visibility is going to actually affect their own lives, put their lives into danger? What happens if those who are not affected as much, for example, are non-trans people or non-Dalit people? What if they put their bodies up front, but then through verbatim performance, are able to recite narratives of trans people and Dalit people. So how can other bodies become representatives or voice other bodies' narratives? And Zoom become the platform for layering those bodies. So that IP addresses could be hidden, so that tracking can be delayed, so that, like dangers can be avoided. So all of this and representation and visibility became huge questions that then my cohort especially focused on in TDE.
That's fascinating. And when you were thinking about Zoom as a place, as a platform where solidarities could be built, I'm also interested in kind of understanding, what are questions of access that came up there? Because I remember that in 2020, when Zoom was obviously becoming super popular as a medium of teaching, learning, doing other things, having teach-ins during protests and things like that, right? There was a lot of Zoom bombing happening. So putting in those like layers of security and checks there, and who had internet access or who didn't, because that became another big issue, right? Of being in these liminal spaces, of being at home, but that home not being that safe space, and therefore not being able to connect online.
Exactly. Because I identify as a queer person, and because at the time also I was working with an organization directly and offering peer support service. It was interesting because I was constantly also aware of the abuse that so many individuals would be facing because of the lack of personal space in their own homes. So I was like, how do I reach them? Because they are the ones who actually need that solidarity space. So that constant questioning was what actually brought me to the headphone verbatim method. Because then they're not speaking for themselves. Then they're sending those narratives in whatever format, recordings, through someone's mouth, through writings, in any format. Those narratives are being read out by other people. And that is how their narratives are reaching us. So whether they're directly on Zoom, at that time stopped mattering. So the headphone is what is happening is literally the body layering, because the person who's listening to you speak out someone else's narrative is aware that there is another narrative that is being read out. And the delay of 1 second is what sets up the body's difference. And that's where art comes in. That is where the delay is where things happen. That's where breath work happens. And that's what makes it theater.
What were some of the ideas around data that you love sharing the most? There are certain things that you learn about and they just become like, oh, this is my favorite thing that I learned out of this, like my aha moment.
Yeah, the thing that we were constantly coming back to, the data as language, data as mediator. That was, I think, my favorite takeaway. Because that is one thing that stuck with me. Data is not truth itself. Data is a mediator. And we need to understand that data translates stuff. Data is not the body. Data is a representation of the body. And that is where the delay is experienced. Just like I was saying, the delay of the breath, the delay in the hearing and the verbatim, the translation happens. That is where we need to locate truth. And that is where we need to locate breaches of data, falsehood, of power. We were constantly thinking of data appropriating our bodies, Facebook's representation of us, targeting us with certain ads. Sure, we don't want Facebook to understand us in certain ways, or understand our profile completely. But we also don't want it to create or limit us to a stereotype false profile. So those kinds of things, data's appropriation of our bodies in ways which can be extremely violent. We were talking about how sex workers use internet as ways to get their clients. If that data is breached, what happens? Whose body is put at risk? Whose visibility puts them at risk, and whose visibility gets them more number of views and more money? So whose body is the one that is appropriated and whose is assimilated? So we were constantly going between this one and that one. And that is why data bodies was such a fascinating topic for us, because we were so many identities and we were such a diverse cohort also. And 2 days ago, I just received a random call. "Ma'am, आप online games खेलते हैं? Do you play online games?" I played 2 games. I play Sudoku and I play Wordle. to keep my brain, to keep myself distracted sometimes. And you don't need registration for these two games, right? You don't need anything. They found my number from somewhere. I was like, Indian data laws, please do something. I can't have this. Like data breaching, it is so dangerous for trans people, for sex workers, for LGBTQ people who have double profiles, for cross-dressing people who have double profiles. After TDE, I've definitely become more conscious of all of that, which is good in a way, but also scary.
I mean, I want to ask you so many more questions on this, but I also want to come back to your experiences at TDE. Could you tell me a little bit about what your role was?
So, as a resident, I was expected to work with a group of people, and all of them were really, they really came from excellent backgrounds, like with so much to contribute. You left with so many questions, you left with so many thoughts that needed to be preserved, marinated, left there for maybe a couple of years, and then revisited. Because those notes are still there in my computer, they're not going anywhere, thanks to data. Uh, so those kinds of things really benefited me as a resident. Yeah.
And I understand as a part of being a resident, you also engaged in co-facilitating some sessions. What was your approach to these sessions? What was your pedagogical approach? And what kind of preparation, if any, did you engage in to create any sort of like a learning environment, perhaps some idea that you went in with that, okay, this is what I would ideally like this discussion to flow like or to look like?
For me, feminist pedagogy in its heart comes from questions. Questions to be asked, questions to be explored, raised, left alone for some time, but there, present, and to be asked. In our cohort, there was a diversity of members. There were people with disabilities. There was more than one non-binary person. There were people from the academic background, people from research backgrounds, people from data and ID backgrounds. You have to include everyone. That's what comes with a sense of when you want to work with the ideal of feminism. So you have to continuously navigate. You have to carry everyone with you. You cannot leave anyone behind. I remember we had this discussion on logic versus emotions. A couple of people were like, but I don't understand why logic versus like understanding social and emotional dynamics is more feminist as opposed to the Western understanding of logic. And we went back to those feminist ideas and thinking about that. And even that opened new doors for us to understand data and digital thinking, because black boxing, AI, works with logic. It is also going towards human by learning emotions. So how is that bridging the gap? So that is how we actually came back to it. And the best part was our cohort was never settled. Our cohort was never settled with the answers. So always, every time and always you're like, but okay, but whose violation? I remember when Anya Kovacs came to deliver their lecture. That was such an interesting lecture. And everyone was like, but who gets to call violence violence? But who gets justice? What is justice in this case? And that was like, that is when we kind of opened our ideas to awareness, disability, social justice in intersectionality. So that is what we always were hovering around throughout the discussions. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And of course, questions then did form like a really critical part of like having those discussions. What else worked? Was it like a larger group discussion that worked best? Was it
personal anecdotes? We all relied on personal anecdotes a lot because a lot of us had a lot going on. So that we were all dealing with a lot of grief, and there was a lot of emotional reliance that was needed at that time. And doing this course, of course, took a lot of energy, which meant that we, as a cohort, we had to depend on each other, rely on each other, and create that atmosphere. A lot of us just came in with anecdotes, and those anecdotes was what led into the discussion directly. Like, for example, we were talking about this experience of AI generation and the idea of sexual violence. And I remember someone at my workplace had talked about this virtual reality. Someone's virtual figures had actually raped a virtual figure of a woman, and that case had gone into some high court, and it had actually been given a fair verdict that it's still considered bodily violation, sexual violation. These kinds of questions, these kinds of anecdotes were actually what were leading us into thinking more critically about data and digital security and just about technology in general. So, anecdotes coming from listening to things around us, from experiencing things of our everyday lives, how grief sits in data, the fact that so many accounts of dead people are still there but will be removed suddenly after what Elon Musk I think took over. And we thought about grief at that time. And that made us settled because it was coming from personal anecdotes again. So instead of forcing questions, we came from personal settings.
So what's this experience? What have you taken back from your experience at TDE?
So after TDE has ended, this is still in the works, but 3 of us from our cohort have actually worked together on an abstract for a research paper, which has been accepted into a conference. So that is what I think we took away from it. Not just teaching each other, but like also adjusting, like making that space for learning. Because once you're in that teaching mindset where you're just like, oh, I'm banking education, you lose the track of learning. And TD kind of like took that away from you. You were like, nah, sit down. We're gonna learn together. And we had a fantastic like facilitator for that, the person who like led us throughout, Anushka, who really held us down. They kind of strung all of our thoughts with a thread. And that is what allowed us to be like, we're not just teaching the other, we're teaching with each other. We're learning with each other. At that time, the teaching and learning boundary kind of blurred. And that is what made it a fascinating experience.
And did you take some of that blurring of teaching and learning, like a co-learning space, into your teaching spaces after?
Oh, yes. Only after TD did I apply to this Kashmir fellowship. I'm teaching now a much younger batch of students. I'm teaching like 9 and 10-year-old students.
Wow.
So it's a fun experience. But by doing that, I have to navigate working with a lot of other teachers. And that means that I have to learn with each other. Again, I have to teach with each other because now we're all teaching fellows. The second thing was, despite going through TDE, I was still very uncomfortable with the idea of power. But that idea also shifted over time. Power is not always to be exerted and asserted, it's to be negotiated. And that is also what we did in TDE without me realizing that even as we were teaching with each other and learning with each other, we were negotiating our powers. We were negotiating our powers of learning, of knowledge. And that is what made it a worthwhile experience. So that is how my pedagogy has shifted, in the sense that questioning doesn't always have to come from a sense of I don't know. It has to come from a sense of I know this. Now, what can you teach me? This is what I can teach you. Now, can we exchange? Can we learn from each other? Now, I want to question you also. What's your question? So that power equation has shifted.
That also changes, right, with different age groups. How do you navigate that, or how do you translate that? Because sometimes when you worked with a certain age group, it becomes challenging. I mean, at least for me, that's been the case, that how do I talk about the same thing with a much younger person?
Drama helps. Because I use my drama techniques in this teaching, it really helps. Because then I stop looking at myself as just a teacher. I start looking at myself as a performer, and at the other students as my co-performers, or sometimes as the audience. It depends on what the class is like. So once I see them as performers and myself as a performer, whether it's with like a younger cohort or an older cohort, you get into the energy. It's the energy that makes a difference. Once it's a younger cohort, you have to match their energy. That shifts. And that is what makes you work with them. Of course, the equation of power also shifts. But then you realize that the energy is what balances that power.
What subjects do you teach there?
I teach English. teaching English to younger children, but I'm also working with. So, for example, one of the tasks I gave them, they were learning a poem called A House and Home, and they had to understand the difference between a house and a home. It's like write a paragraph or write an essay on why Kashmir is your home. I'm learning from them. I'm learning about their writing skills. Sure, I may be teaching them writing skills, but I have to first learn about their writing skills. I have to learn about Kashmir, and only then can I reach them anything. So the power equation still exists, but when my energy changes, the equation is constantly dynamic. It is constantly shifting in the class, and that is what makes it a little easier to navigate.
Lovely. And of course, you've shared many, many reflections, many things you've taken away from TDE. So just like one thing perhaps that you took away that you think, you sort of practice in your day-to-day lives that we haven't spoken about yet, that you took away from the course.
I took away a life skill, which comes as a surprise, but I took away a life skill. I was like, stop looking at everything with rose-tinted glasses. Be critical of everything. Even when a person asks you for your mobile number for a bill, do not trust. But also simply the idea that I do not give negative ratings to Uber drivers anymore. I just be like, if they are breaking a signal, I will not give them a rating. That's okay. Just don't give a negative rating. That's what I've started doing. So these little things are my takeaways. It's not like a massive per se, but these little things. My lexicon was about digital is not equal to technology, and technology is not equal to digital, which is a distinction I think we've forgotten, a lot of us. One of my senior classmates is designing manual technologies. And I was like, wow, had we forgotten about this age when manual technology was still a thing? Why are there no such things anymore? Why are we only being sold like products that are run through electricity and by plug points and everything that consumes a lot of data? Like, so that realization came late, but it took me back to the basics. So yeah, those are the things that would take like a major takeaway.